How troubled were you by the findings laid out in the warehouse and neglect report that your finance committee released this week?
I was outraged. The notion that these centers are abusing these kids and then getting paid with government dollars is just outrageous. And we need to do better oversight. We need to hold these firms accountable. But I also have to tell you, to a certain level, I was not totally surprised, because a little known fact, and these were kids who were oftentimes from foster care and others, but I've seen, through friends, my own family, others, many of the treatment centers for drug or alcohol rehabilitation or eating disorder treatment centers, over the last 10 to 15 years, the vast number of them have been all bought up by private equity. So you might have had a center that originally, you had a director that their heart was in the right place and they'd try to do the right thing for, whether it would be kids or somebody trying to be in recovery. And then some firm comes in and views each of these kids or person in recovery as a individual profit center. And the humanity gets squeezed out. And in these cases of these centers that are funded by government, it's enormous abuse. It needs to be brought to an end. These firms need to be held accountable.
More than a half dozen CBS 6 stories were cited in the report from our series of investigative reports on the Cumberland Children's Hospital in New King County. Are you concerned about the situation at the hospital?
Yeah, I've just seen the top line of the report. I know some of the work that your station has done, but if we've got evidence of this kind of abuse taking place, it needs to be held accountable. Now that is done at the state level in terms of oversight. But the unfortunate thing is, I'm concerned that this is not just happening in these type of hospitals, but frankly is the result of a much broader effort to have private equity firms that come in and try to squeeze out the maximum amount of profit, oftentimes cutting back on staff, or oftentimes looking at how they can squeeze the last dollar out as opposed to how they can help oftentimes young people recover or to be able to lead to productive lives.
What should the federal government's role be in protecting the vulnerable patients at Cumberland?
The federal goals, or federal government's job, since this is usually Medicaid and federal dollars paying for this, is we got to provide better oversight. We've got to hold more accountable. We probably need additional legislation. But oftentimes as well, where these institutions are oftentimes also regulated at the state level, and oftentimes, I remember as governor, we had to look into types of abuse. But oftentimes it is a state that has a closer connection. The state can help expose the abuse, then the feds can come in and make sure that the federal dollars that pay them, they don't get paid if they don't, protect the people that they're charged with.
And the final question on the list, the president and CEO of UHS, which operates Cumberland and other hospitals that face similar accusations of patient abuse and neglect, was invited to testify at Wednesday's hearing but declined. Do you think the company needs to address these issues?
The company needs to address these issues, and if they don't voluntarily appear, there is the ability for the finance committee, and I believe this would be very bipartisan, to issue a subpoena, and that's usually the last resort. But we need to get answers.
And today, with everyone showing up today, communities coming together, what
This is like, a couple years back when women lost their right to get an abortion, to have reproductive health services. People said, well, that will be the end. Well, we've seen there are now efforts to cut back on right to contraception. We've now had one of the largest denominations in the country come out yesterday against IVF, the ability for those families who can't conceive otherwise to use in vitro fertilization. So I think this attack against women's health care is ongoing. The last couple of weeks, we've had bills on the floor of the Senate where those senators who say, oh, I don't want to touch contraception, or I want to make sure IVF is protected. People had the right to go on record. Unfortunately, on my Republican friends, other than 2 Republican women senators, all the rest voted no.
I mean, voters at home, like you mentioned, they have to go out and vote. Can you elaborate more on that?
Yeah, it's like here's where I think people, some elected officials are getting this wrong. Even in the most conservative states in the country, when voters have been asked, should we allow women the right to choose? Should they have reproductive health freedom? Voters have said yes. And this year, in Virginia and across the country, voters are going to be asked that question again, because I'm hugely bipartisan, but on this issue, unfortunately, it breaks down. One side is not willing to enshrine in law the right to contraceptive, the right to have IVF, the right to have women's reproductive health care protected. And folks like me and other Democrats are willing to vote yes on that. A lot of decisions people have to make when they vote, but I think about the young woman, Ella, who's 19, the fact that she's going to have to grow the next 10 or 15 years in many parts of America, couldn't have the same reproductive choices that my daughters had or that my wife had, is pretty amazing in this country.